People come to poetry because we've got a certain reputation. People think we're one of the most romantic spots in town. And I'm not going to argue with that at all. This is the place, you know, that you go to for that special evening. Soft lights, wonderful food, music that's just right. Poetry's got a rhythm all its own. Sure, not everyone here has romance on their minds. We get business people and families here too. And just between you and me, sometimes people come to poetry just because they're hungry. But whatever their rhymes or reasons, they've all come here for an experience they really can't get anywhere else. Because frankly, we try to spoil every one of our customers. So we work really hard to make sure everything goes just right for everyone's special evening, no matter what it is. And it all starts well before the evening begins. And I'm not talking about the atmosphere or the mood, but the food. It's not enough that the food is merely wonderful, which it is, but the food has to be safe. And your responsibility for the safety of the food in your establishment begins long before any food is actually served to the customer. Your responsibilities actually begin with your purchasing, receiving, and storage procedures. Here's what you need to know: how to prevent cross-contamination, the proper procedures for time and temperature control, general purchasing principles, general guidelines for receiving and inspecting food, criteria for accepting and rejecting deliveries of different kinds of food, and general storage guidelines. The safety of the food at your establishment will depend largely on how well you apply food safety practices throughout the flow of food. The flow begins with purchasing and receiving and goes all the way through storing, preparing, cooking, holding, cooling, reheating, and serving. To keep food safe, it is important to prevent cross-contamination and time and temperature abuse throughout the entire flow of food in your establishment. Let me spell it out. Cross-contamination is the transfer of microorganisms from one food or surface to another. And it can happen almost anywhere in your operation. But once you know how and where these microorganisms can be transferred, cross-contamination is pretty simple to prevent. For starters, you may want to designate specific cutting boards and utensils for raw food, while at the same time designating a different set for ready-to-eat food. Now, although this practice minimizes the risk of cross-contamination, it doesn't eliminate the need for proper cleaning and sanitizing practices. You should clean and sanitize all your work surfaces, equipment, and utensils after each and every task. And if you have only a single prep table, you have to prepare raw meat, fish, poultry, and ready-to-eat food at different times. Another factor responsible for foodborne illness outbreaks is time and temperature abuse. Foodborne pathogens grow at temperatures between 41 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 and 57 Celsius. When food is in this range, it's in the temperature danger zone. Remember that whenever food is held in the temperature danger zone, it's being abused, and you could have problems. Besides temperature, time also plays a critical role in food safety. That's because foodborne microorganisms that can cause illness need both time and the proper temperature to grow. The longer food stays in the temperature danger zone, the more time pathogens have to grow and make food unsafe. So you should always minimize the time food spends in the temperature danger zone. If food is held in this dangerous range for 4 hours or more, you've got to throw it out. When you purchase food products, you should always start by buying only from suppliers who get their products from approved sources. And that approved food source is one that has been inspected and is in compliance with applicable local, state, and federal law. Don't accept any product from an unapproved source. You literally don't know what you'll be getting. Now, when it comes to receiving the products you've purchased, you have to make sure your employees have enough time to thoroughly check everything. so you should schedule deliveries for off-peak hours and only receive one delivery at a time. And this is very important. Your receiving staff should have the authority to accept, reject, and sign for deliveries. Every shipment needs to be checked for color, texture, odor, intact packaging, and any signs of refreezing, prior wetness, and pest infestation. You've gone through a lot of trouble to purchase the best quality products you can get, so make sure you're getting what you're paying for. All deliveries need to be inspected immediately, and the items should be put away as quickly as possible. This is especially true for refrigerated and frozen products. Internal temperatures should be checked and recorded. Remember that when you're checking sample temperatures of received food items, make sure you're using thermometers that have been properly cleaned, sanitized, and calibrated. All products should be checked to make sure that they're within the use-by date. Now, if the inspection turns up a product that should be rejected, here's what to do. That item should be set aside. Then they need to tell the delivery person exactly what's wrong with the product. But make sure they get a signed adjustment or credit slip from the delivery person before the rejected product is thrown out or given back to the delivery person. Then they should log the incident on the invoice or the receiving document. Inspecting deliveries requires a well-trained eye to notice the subtle differences. You have to look at color, texture, and smell. That can tell you a lot about the product that you have purchased. Meat will have a mandatory inspection stamp on the packaging. Remember that the word inspected doesn't mean the product is free of microorganisms. It just means that the product and processing plant has met certain government standards. The product still has to be handled safely despite the fact that it's been inspected. Here's the checklist you and your staff should use when inspecting meat. The temperature should be 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 Celsius, or lower. And when you're talking about the color of the meat, beef should be bright cherry red, not brown or green. Although aged beef might be darker in color, and vacuum-packed beef will appear purplish in color. As far as the texture of meat, it should be firm and spring back when touched. Reject it if its texture is slimy, sticky, or dry. The meat should also have no odor. And the packaging has to be intact and clean. Packaging that is damaged, like broken cartons, dirty wrappers, torn packaging, vacuum packaging with broken seals, should be rejected. And you should inspect poultry just as carefully as meat. Poultry is inspected by the USDA or the State Department of Agriculture in much the same way as meat. So look for the mandatory inspection stamp on its packaging. If it's fresh, poultry should be shipped in self-draining crushed ice or chill-packed. You can accept poultry deliveries if they meet the following standards. The temperature should be 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 Celsius, or lower. And it should have no discoloration. Reject it if it has purple or green discoloration around the neck or dark wing tips. But if the tips are red, it's acceptable. The texture of the flesh should be firm and spring back when touched. There shouldn't be any stickiness under the wings or around joints. And just like meat, poultry should have no odor. Fresh fish is very sensitive to time temperature abuse and can deteriorate quickly if handled improperly. Here are the kinds of things to look for when inspecting fish. Make sure the temperature is 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 Celsius, or lower. Check the color. If it has bright red gills and bright shiny skin, it's acceptable. You don't want fish with dull gray gills and dull dry skin. The texture of the flesh should be firm and it should spring back when touched. Fish with soft flesh that leaves an imprint when touched should be rejected. It's okay for it to have a mild ocean or seaweed smell. But if there is a strong fishy odor or it smells of ammonia, it should be rejected. Look at the eyes. Make sure they're bright, clear, and full, not red-rimmed, cloudy, and sunken. And it should be received surrounded by crushed, self-draining ice. When it comes to shellfish, like clams, oysters, and mussels, they must be purchased from approved sources. Live shellfish must be received with shell stock identification tags. And these must remain attached to the container they were delivered in until all of the shellfish have been used. Then you have to keep the tags on file for 90 days from the harvest date of the shellfish. Live shellfish have intact shells and will close when tapped. Reject shellfish that don't pass this test. With egg deliveries, there's a few things to consider. First, make sure they've been purchased from approved government-inspected suppliers. The egg cartons must have a mandatory USDA inspection stamp on them. Liquid, frozen, and dehydrated eggs must be pasteurized as required by law and bear the USDA inspection mark. And when they're delivered, liquid and frozen eggs should be refrigerated or frozen at the proper temperature. You can accept the delivery of eggs if the air temperature of the truck is 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 Celsius, or lower. Look at the shells. They should be clean and unbroken. Eggs with dirty or cracked shells should be refused. There's a slightly different set of guidelines to follow regarding produce deliveries. First, fresh fruit and vegetables have different temperature requirements for transportation and storage, but no specific temperature is mandated by regulation. The only exception is cut melons, which must be received and stored at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 Celsius, or lower. The receiving criteria for produce varies depending on the items being delivered, but in general, you should reject produce that shows signs of spoilage. This includes insect infestation, mold, cuts, wilting and mushiness, discoloration and dull appearance, and unpleasant odors and tastes. When you're receiving fresh cut produce, reject any items that have passed their expiration date. You should also refuse shipment of bruised produce. Because the bruises provide a potential entry point for pathogens, they can pose a food safety risk. More and more establishments are purchasing ready-to-eat food items, such as pre-cut meats, refrigerated entrees that only require heating, and fresh cut fruits and vegetables. Many of these items come in reduced oxygen packaging, including MAP, vacuum packaging, and sous vide. Make sure the packaging is intact and in good condition. You should refuse delivery if the packages are torn, leaking, or have expired product use-by dates. Frozen food should not show signs of having been thawed and refrozen. Look for fluids or frozen liquids in case bottoms, ice crystals or water stains on the packaging, or large ice crystals on the product itself. The presence of any of those signs is evidence of thawing and refreezing, and the shipment should be rejected. The last category of food I want to talk about is dry food. One of the most important things to remember about dry food is that it must be kept dry. However, dry food often attracts pests, creating storage problems later. Dry food should be delivered without holes or tears, and obviously, there should be no signs of having been wet. And if it contains insects, insect eggs, or rodent droppings, well, there's really no question. Put it all back on the truck it came in on. But receiving is only half the story. Storage has its own set of concerns because poor storage practices can really ruin the rhythm of your operation. You should set up some general storage guidelines and have your staff put them into practice. You need to clear a space in storage for new products. And you want to make sure everything already in storage is properly labeled. If an item is produced on site, the label should include the name of the food and the date by which it should be sold, consumed, or discarded. Once food has been properly labeled, you have to arrange products to make sure that the oldest inventory is used first. This method is used in refrigerated, frozen, and dry storage, and it's called first in, first out. Be sure to discard any food items that have passed their use-by date or manufacturer's expiration date. And remember, any potentially hazardous ready-to-eat food prepared on site can only be stored for a total of 7 days at 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 Celsius or lower. After 7 days, it must be thrown away. Sometimes you need to transfer food from its original packaging to another container. The new container must be cleaned and sanitized and have a tight-fitting lid. Be sure to label that new container with the name of the food and the original use-by date. And here's a major red flag. You should never put food in empty chemical containers or use empty food containers to store chemicals. Now here's the thing about storing newly received refrigerated and frozen food, or any food that needs time and temperature control for safety. You have to keep them out of the temperature danger zone by storing them as soon as they've been inspected. And make sure you only store food in designated storage areas. Cleanliness is a real issue with your designated storage areas. The floors, walls, and shelving in refrigerators, freezers, dry storerooms, and heated holding cabinets have to be cleaned on a regular basis. Make it a rule to clean up leaks and spills right away to keep them from contaminating other foods and providing food for pests. And get into the routine of checking the temperature of stored foods regularly. Randomly sample the internal temperature of refrigerated food to ensure that the temperature is 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 Celsius or lower. Check frozen products to make sure that they're frozen. Proper storage practices also means that you don't overload refrigerators and freezers. Storing too many products prevents good airflow and makes the unit work harder to stay cold. Refrigerator and freezer doors should also be kept closed as much as possible. Frequent opening lets warm air inside, which can affect food safety and make units work harder. If raw meat, poultry, and fish can't be stored by themselves, make sure you store cooked and ready-to-eat food above these items. This will prevent raw product juices from dripping onto the prepared food and causing a foodborne illness. Raw meat, poultry, and fish have to be stored in the following top-to-bottom order in refrigerators: whole fish, whole cuts of beef and pork, ground meats and fish, whole and ground poultry. This order is based upon the minimum internal cooking temperature of each food. You have to pay just as much attention to the guidelines for placing food in dry storage. Your dry storerooms need to be kept cool and dry because heat and moisture are the biggest dangers to dry and canned foods. To assure the safety of your dry food and to maintain optimum quality, keep the temperature of the storeroom between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 and 21 Celsius. Relative humidity can also affect food safety, so try to keep your dry storage area at 50 to 60% if possible. Your storeroom should also be well ventilated. This will help keep the temperature and humidity constant throughout the storage area. Your dry food has to be stored away from walls and at least 6 inches, 15 centimeters, off the floor. And it should never be stored near chemicals or cleaning supplies. You also need to keep dry food out of direct sunlight. And above all, keep the area clean. Well, even in a romantic spot like this, I'll admit there's nothing romantic about purchasing, receiving, and storing. But directly or indirectly, everything that happens in the back of the house eventually has an impact on the front of the house. And you know, nothing, and I mean nothing, can ruin a special evening faster than a foodborne illness. And if good practices can help keep that special rhythm we have here at Poetry, then I'm all for it.